The first half season, or whatever they want to call it, of Star Trek Discovery is now complete. So, in regards to whether or not it was any good, I can finally say with 100% conviction that it was alright.
This video contains spoilers for Star Trek Discovery.
There are definitely aspects of Discovery that I really enjoy. First and foremost being that the show exists in the first place. It's been 12 years since the previous television incarnation of Star Trek went off the air, and the only thing we'd seen from the franchise between that and this have been 3 badly written derivative action movies based loosely on the original series. So for a while there, it seemed like Trek had truly run its course. There were a lot of creative decisions made on Star Trek Discovery that I think were great. I love the whole concept of the ship, its crew, and its mission. STD is the first series in the franchise where it seems like there's meant to be some ambiguity to the overall intentions of the captain and his ship. The Discovery is essentially a military experimentation vessel, the mission of which is top secret and is initially left a mystery to the viewer. Contrast this with any other Star Trek series where the motivations and dilemmas of the ship and its crew are usually told to the viewer up front through personal logs in each episode's opening.
Captain's log, stardate 45854.2. The Enterprise is charting 6 star systems that make up the Argolis cluster.
It's a different side to Starfleet than what we've seen before, and it really gives the show an air of intrigue, which is refreshing, and helps Discovery to stand out from other Trek series in a positive way. On the other hand, there are several issues that I had with the series as well, first and foremost being that the writing is wildly inconsistent. There are also a few creative decisions that I thought were poorly made, but we'll get into all that. First, let's start with the story.
Part 1, the story.
Star Trek Discovery's story is well written and interesting for the most part. Following the events of the pilot episodes, the Federation has been locked in a brutal interstellar war with the Klingons for the better part of a year. The USS Discovery is a secret science vessel attempting to perfect the experimental mycelium spore drive, a new means of space travel which, if fully functional, would grant ships the ability to leap instantaneously to theoretically any point in the known universe. This is obviously a big priority for Starfleet, as it would be hugely beneficial in the war effort. Discovery's captain, Gabriel Lorca, is particularly obsessed with getting the spore drive operational, often at the expense of other important considerations.
I wish I didn't have to ask you to make this sacrifice, but the Klingons won't stop until they've destroyed everything in their path.
These first episodes deal primarily with discovering and harnessing the properties of the spore drive, and then grappling with the moral implications of using such a device. Discovery's first season is less episodic than previous seasons of Trek have been, with the introduction of season-long arcs that had previously been utilized on DS9 and Enterprise, but never to this extent. The topics of the spore drive and the war with the Klingons are central in nearly every episode. The series' main theme seems from this first half season to be the balancing act of what is or is not permissible for the greater good.
Logic clearly dictates that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Or the one.
This is the main character's central dilemma in the pilot episodes, though I think in that case the execution was fumbled somewhat. In the rest of the season, though, this theme is very well executed, especially in the 5th episode, Choose Your Pain, which was the first in the series where I got a twinge of that old Star Trek-y feeling, and I really began to enjoy the show and get behind Michael Burnham as the protagonist. Unfortunately, not every episode fares as well as number 5. I absolutely hated the 2 pilot episodes, and honestly, I think that with a few small rewrites, they could have been done away with entirely, and the show would have been better for it. The rest of the series is somewhat uneven as well. There are 1 or 2 episodes that were incredibly frustrating for me to watch because while I really enjoyed them conceptually and liked a lot of the performances, there were elements of the writing that held them back from reaching the greatness of episode 5. I also really disliked the entire subplot detailing the inner politics of the Klingon Empire. Most of it felt like unnecessary filler, and every time the show cut away to them, which is frequently, I found myself wishing that we were back on Discovery instead, even if just for a few more scenes of the crew brushing their teeth. These are just my opinions though. Your mileage may vary. Overall, minus some shaky writing and the entirely disposable Klingon B-plot, I found the story of Star Trek Discovery Season 1, Part 1 to be very enjoyable. I was overwhelmingly relieved to see that the show's writers are choosing to narrow in on moral dilemmas as the show's central focus, which puts Discovery very much in line with classic Star Trek and makes it feel more like a genuine continuation of the franchise I grew up with than the terrible reboot films ever did. It's also entirely possible that some of the problems with the writing are a direct result of this show's infamously troubled production schedule and will be rectified in future seasons. Not all of the problems with Discovery are objective problems, though. There were some that really only dedicated fans will be bothered by. This leads me to...
Part 2, nitpicky fan stuff that nobody else cares about.
Star Trek Discovery is set approximately 10 years prior to the start of the original series, and this is my first problem with the show right off the bat. It should have been a sequel, not a prequel. Making this show a prequel to every other show in the franchise besides the one that nobody likes was a bad call in my opinion, primarily because franchise lore is such a big deal to the majority of Star Trek fans. This is not a technical problem with the quality of the show, but it does invite all sorts of scrutiny from fans that otherwise would not have been nearly as severe. For one, the level of technological advancement appears to be wildly more advanced than not only the original series, but even a lot of what we see in the follow-up series that take place 100 years later. This is understandable, of course. Our own technology has advanced considerably since 1966. Some of the concepts that were only science fiction on TOS are now a reality for us in 2017. The bulky communicator device that you have to pull out and operate with your hands, for example, seems to me to be completely anachronistic in a world set 250 years after the invention of Google Home. Then there are issues with the timeline. Setting this series 10 years before TOS opens an entirely new can of worms in regards to what should or should not be happening in the show. The existence of the spore drive, for example, seems like something that Starfleet should have really devoted a lot of R&D into improving in the interim 100 years between Discovery and TNG. I'm sure the writers will come up with some contrived reason for why this didn't happen, but for now it seems very odd. The full-scale war that has started with the Klingon Empire also seems out of place when you consider that this is occurring a mere decade before the TOS episode Errand of Mercy, where a similar war with the Klingons is avoided, with nary a mention of this previous one. The events of that episode are referenced even through to the Next Generation 100 years later, so why not this war on Discovery as well? There are also some other small things. The holographic communication system you see a few times throughout the season feels like something that wouldn't have been possible until DS9 or Voyager era, and at one point you even see what seems to be a proto-holodeck, which didn't feel inconsistent with the other technology you see on Discovery, but is inconsistent with what we know about the holodeck from TNG. Setting the show later on in the timeline would have avoided these problems entirely, and would have also opened up the door to cameos by a full 3 pre-existing casts of Star Trek characters. I know that we've got characters like Spock's father, Sarek, and Harry Mudd, who are around in TOS making cameo appearances in this show, which is nice, but the tension of having an entire episode revolve around whether Sarek is going to die is completely undermined by the fact that we already know exactly when and where Sarek is going to die, and it won't be for quite some time. As I said, none of these observations are any reflection on the quality of the series, but it does break my immersion with the show as someone who's familiar with the franchise.
Part 3, the characters.
Sonequa Martin Green as Michael Burnham is perhaps the first main character that a Star Trek show has ever had. Sure, in classic Trek, emphasis would often be placed on the commanding officer of each series, since they're the ones that the important decisions would end up falling on at the end of the day. But I never really thought of Kirk or Picard or Sisko, etc. as the protagonists of their respective shows in the same way that Michael Burnham is the protagonist of Discovery. Every single episode of the show revolves around Burnham and her perspective and impact on the story, while past Trek shows would always have a variety of episodes centered around other characters on the ship besides the top-billed actor, making them feel more like ensemble casts than Discoveries. This is all fine conceptually, since as I said, a lot of the show's story is initially framed as being mysterious, so it makes sense to have just one character be the lens through which the audience gets to know everything and everyone else around her.
What the hell is going on this ship?
The problem ends up being the off-putting way that the character of Michael Burnham is written. In the pilot episodes, Burnham is the first officer of a ship called the USS Shenzhou. In these first 2 episodes, she does basically nothing but make one poor decision after another, culminating in the death of her captain, the destruction of the Shenzhou, a war breaking out with the Klingon Empire, and Burnham herself being sentenced to prison for the rest of her life. Yet, since we see and experience everything through her, it seems at times like the show expects us to be rooting for her throughout all of these proceedings when, at least to me, all of the actions that she takes come off as foolish and ill-advised.
Captain, please. I'm trying to save you.
After the pilot is done, Burnham joins the Discovery where she keeps her head down, quietly seeking redemption for all the trouble she's caused, and does her best to help Discovery's crew in the war effort. Again, this makes sense conceptually, except that on top of everything else, this character was raised as a Vulcan, and so strives at all times to uphold the highest virtue a Vulcan can theoretically possess: being an emotionless robot. So even after the shift in her character, when Burnham actually does start making better decisions, the character does everything in her power to remain stuffy and unapproachable in most of her interactions with other characters.
Personality doesn't count. That's just something people with no personality say. Wait, which in no way means you absolutely have a personality!
She usually comes off as morose, and she's not nearly as fun or engaging to watch as anyone else in the main cast. Sonequa Martin-Green does the best she's able to with the material she's given, and fares better than I think most would at playing this part. I just think that the Michael Burnham character was not very well thought out in terms of what the show needed her to be: its main protagonist and audience surrogate. This not only makes it difficult for the viewer to like her, but it also makes it frustrating at times to even watch the show, since, again, unlike with other Star Trek shows, so much of the story of Discovery revolves around this single character and how she fits into everything else. That brings me to the supporting cast. Jason Isaacs as Captain Gabriel Lorca is easily the best among them. Let me sum up this character by drawing parallels with some other Star Trek series. He feels like if you took the sort of shifty Starfleet admiral type guy with a hidden agenda who would have appeared as an antagonist on an episode of TNG, swapped him in for Captain Archer on the Enterprise, and then dropped him straight into the middle of the Dominion War from DS9. Lorca is a man with questionable morals, in charge of an advanced experimental ship that could turn the tide of the war with the Klingons in the Federation's favor. And the first several episodes worth of his screen time, following his introduction and the story proper, are spent trying to keep the viewer guessing as to exactly what the intentions of the character will turn out to be.
I like to think it makes me mysterious.
Even the majority of his senior officers seem not to trust him very much. Jason Isaacs is no stranger to playing sinister characters, and he gives Lorca a sort of playfully sleazy, yet charismatic and oddly sincere demeanor. He's a lot of fun to watch, and since it's made clear from the start that Captain Lorca is not meant to be the show's moral authority figure as past Star Trek captains have been, it's easier to revel in his misdeeds and root for him than it would be otherwise.
I think you've been testing me.
And why would I do that?
Rounding out the rest of the cast are Doug Jones as Lieutenant Commander Suru, Discovery's alien first officer who served with Michael Burnham on the Shenzhou, Anthony Rapp as Lieutenant Paul Stamets, the science officer in charge of Discovery's secret research, Mary Wiseman as Cadet Sylvia Tilly, Burnham's eccentric roommate, and Shazad Latif as Lieutenant Ash Taylor, Discovery's chief of security and love interest for Burnham. The entire cast of characters are performed well, though I do wish that each of the supporting cast had a bit more time to grow and develop as individuals, especially Stamets and Suru, who I found to both be particularly engaging characters who get very little screen time. In recurring roles, Wilson Cruz plays Dr. Hugh Culber, Discovery's chief medical officer and Lieutenant Stamets' partner. James Frain and Rainn Wilson each guest star several times as younger versions of characters from the original series, Sarek and Harry Mudd respectively.
You haven't seen the last of Harcourt Fenton Mudd!
Michelle Yeoh guest stars in the pilot episodes as Philippa Georgiou, Burnham and Suru's former captain on the Shenzhou, and there are several recurring background bridge characters on the Discovery, as well as several recurring Klingon characters. Speaking of the Klingons...
Part 4, everything about the Klingons is awful.
Good lord, do I hate just about every decision made in regards to the Klingons on this show. These Klingons are so completely different from earlier incarnations that they may as well be a totally different species. In fact, I sincerely wish that they had been a completely different species. First of all, their new look. Now, I've seen a lot of people online defending the new creative direction that Star Trek Discovery has taken the Klingons in, citing the fact that the Klingons have already undergone a huge overhaul once before in the franchise. And yes, while it is true that the Klingons went from this to this between the original series and the Next Generation, I still call foul. The original Klingons, like virtually everything else about TOS, looked completely silly by 1979 when Star Trek the Motion Picture was being made. And, like everything else about TOS, their look was updated to look more alien and less like just people wearing face paint. However, this look for the Klingons has stayed more or less consistent ever since then, with the original TOS Klingons being cheekily lampshaded by Worf in an episode of DS9.
Those are Klingons? They are Klingons.
Some kind of genetic engineering? A viral mutation?
We do not discuss it with outsiders.
And we're even given a canon explanation in a 2-part episode of Enterprise.
In the future, it may be possible to reverse the cosmetic effects.
Millions of my people will have to live with this disfigurement.
My point is that while there is some precedent for changing the look of the Klingons, in this case there was absolutely no reason to do so. Nothing to gain, but everything to lose. The TNG-style Klingon design still holds up today, and its inclusion here would have gone a long way towards building good faith with Star Trek fans, who Discovery's producers had clearly been attempting to reach out to by setting this show in the original timeline rather than the terrible reboot film series. The decision to change the look of the Klingons seems to have been made more just for the sake of doing it than for any actual reason. So much is stylistically different about the Klingons, from their design to how their society appears to work. These Klingons resemble real-world religious extremists more than anything else, that I really do have to question why they weren't just made into a completely new species. I know it's because the Klingons are the most well-known Star Trek aliens besides Vulcans, but, and this should be self-explanatory, but I'll explain it anyway, there's no point in using the Klingons for brand recognition if you're going to change every single aspect of the Klingons that made them recognizable in the first place. It's counterintuitive, and it only serves to alienate existing fans, since I would argue that any non-Trek fan wouldn't care at all whether this particular alien guy is supposed to be called a Klingon or not. My other major problem with the Klingons in Star Trek Discovery is that we spend entirely too much time with them. They're the only alien species that ever comes into direct conflict with the Discovery, and even when they aren't in conflict with them, almost every episode is peppered with interluding scenes where we get to see what the Klingons are up to, and I just don't care about the Klingons. They're all uninteresting, one-note characters whose screen time could be far better spent with the Discovery crew. And these scenes seem to take forever, since every character in them is speaking very slowly in Klingon.
Conclusion.
It may seem like I'm being a bit overly critical of Star Trek Discovery, but if that's the case, then it's only because I not only love this franchise, but can also see the depth of potential that this latest iteration of Trek could deliver on in the future. The aspects of the show that count the most, story, themes, characters, etc., are for the most part given solid foundations in this first season, and there is room to grow and improve as Discovery continues. I will definitely continue to watch to see where the show boldly goes from here. Star Trek Discovery may have its shortcomings, but overall this is still probably a stronger first season than even Next Gen had, and Next Gen is the best show in the entire franchise.
Fight me.
I also haven't mentioned this so far because it's largely irrelevant to the show's objective quality, but Star Trek Discovery feels more cinematic than it ever has before on the silver screen. The visual effects as well as the cinematography completely eclipse anything we've seen on Trek before, reaching the heights of other shows such as Game of Thrones or Battlestar Galactica. I look forward to seeing more of the adventures of the USS Discovery and her crew, and I'll be back to give my final thoughts on this season as a whole once it concludes next year. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to know what you thought about Star Trek Discovery as well, so if you've got something to share, please leave it down in the comments below. I'd love to get a conversation going. Also, if you really liked the video, please be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more content in the future. And until next time, take care.